Guess who's back? Back again. Uta's back, and apparently those of us who aren't intellectually disabled aren't autistic. Who knew? Tell a friend. Dame Uta Frith has now formally published the argument that I've already covered twice on this channel. She says autism has been stretched beyond recognition, that masking could lower the diagnostic threshold to 0, and that many late diagnosed autistic people, like me, without an intellectual disability, should belong somewhere else. Where? She doesn't know. Her paper proposes a category which has yet to be given a name. Very helpful. You clicked for Uta Frith's new autism paper, and we are going to read the paper today. And there's a twist later in the video when we compare the paper with something Uta said only 4 months earlier. For now, grab a cup of tea, tap the like button if you haven't already, and strap in. We're going to take the strongest possible version of her 8 major arguments, then follow the evidence and see whether it supports them. I'll be honest, I am in a rush to get this video out because this argument will not stay tucked away in some dry academic journal that few people read. I know what's going to happen. It is going to become a Tory graph headline.
Hello, editing Mike here. Look at this. Lo and behold, I was right. The Tory graph. Anyone can have autism now, says research pioneer.
Then a Daily Mail headline.
Oh yeah, the Daily Mail. It says, social media has made autism too popular. We're the cool kids now. And anyone of any age can now have it, expert says. It's not actually what she said either.
And eventually turn up at Sunday lunch in the mouth of your unhinged family member who proudly announces that everyone's autistic now and that kids these days and you should have some other category but not autism, the spectrum's too wide, and maybe some other comments about immigrants. So I'm hoping this video rebuttal to Uta's piece will help those of you around the unhinged dining table and also those viewers who work on or with academic journalism. I've covered Uta's career before, but the short version is that she made major contributions to autism research. She helped consolidate the shift away from parent-blaming theories, including the refrigerator mother theory, towards a more cognitive and biological explanation of autism. Oh, we have a ferret. This is Anna ferret. Oh, I still have a ferret. No longer. Uta also co-developed the famous Sally Ann false belief test with Simon Baron-Cohen and Alan Leslie. This is where Sally hides a marble, leaves, and moves it, and then the child is then asked where Sally will look. In the original study, 16 of the 20, that's it, 16 of the 20 autistic children gave the marble's real location. By contrast, 23 of 27 typically developing children and 12 out of 14 children with Down syndrome also passed the false belief question. That result was interpreted as evidence of an autistic theory of mind deficit. It measures performance on one explicit false belief problem and then draws a sweeping conclusion that has since been heavily challenged, including by me on this channel. Some autistic people pass Uta's theory of mind test. Plenty of non-autistic people fail, particularly very young children and children with delayed access to language. Performance is closely related to language comprehension and other demands of the task. So failure cannot simply be translated into autism or into mind blindness or into some lack of empathy. Knowing where a doll will search for a marble tells us very, very little about navigating an actual adult conversation. Uta has been Emeritus Professor at UCL since 2006. And if you want the full backstory, I've covered her career and contributions in my previous 2 videos. I will link them. The short version is that she now thinks that the spectrum is close to collapse and wants to split it. In March, Uta was interviewed by the Times Educational Supplement. In May, she appeared in New Scientist. In August, she published this editorial in Psychological Medicine. The paper names none of the people or organisations that have publicly challenged the earlier interviews this summer. Not autistic people, not the National Autistic Society, not even her former student, Sir Simon Baron-Cohen. It reads as if the public debate and counter-argument of the previous 5 months has never happened. That's quite the escalation, from paper to magazine to journal, all while ignoring everything and everyone who disagrees with you. That said, there is nothing inherently wrong with publishing an editorial, which is what this is. It's an opinion piece. It's a letter to the editor from Ms. Flustered of Cambridge. A conceptual paper can make an important contribution without collecting any new data. The double empathy problem itself began as a short theoretical paper, not as an experiment. The issue is what the argument claims to have established. Under methods, the abstract says, This essay considers possible reasons for the changes and their consequences. Then, under results, it says the cultural changes she discusses have all led to a lowering of the diagnostic threshold, and that autism's cultural popularity boosted numbers via self-diagnosis and a search for identity. These are empirical and causal conclusions. They go beyond proposing questions for debate, and this should have been caught in the review process. That said, Uta is a household name in this space, and I doubt anyone, short of Simon Baron-Cohen, would feel confident in correcting Uta, so maybe, as a professional YouTuber, I'll continue. This essay contains no original analysis and no systematic evidence review capable of telling us how much misdiagnosis exists, whether people have in fact been misdiagnosed, or whether these cultural changes, whatever they are, have caused it. A neutral investigation would compare at least three possibilities: whether broader diagnosis is identifying autistic people we previously missed, whether it is misclassifying some non-autistic people, or if both processes are happening at once. Uta's editorial repeatedly begins with the second explanation already favoured. My criticism is not that an editorial lacks an experiment or systematic review. The problem is the mismatch between the strength of its conclusions and the evidence that Uta uses to reach them. This is especially ironic in a paper which goes on to repeatedly question the scientific basis of other people's evidence, but applies no such scrutiny to its own. This finding fits with the notion that the increase occurred in a section of the autism spectrum where intellectual disability is rarely seen. Can you do me a favour, as we work through this paper, watch what Uta uses as her anchor of certainty. She writes that the stark differences between early and late diagnosed cases in population studies provide a sound basis for acknowledging two large subgroups. What are the stark differences that she actually identifies? Age of diagnosis, obviously, language and learning difficulties, and intellectual disability. The later group has different pattern of genetic correlations, which we'll get to, but whenever the prose becomes most confident about who is definitely autistic, that is, high support needs, language disability, and intellectual disability, move to the centre of the frame. This does not prove that Uta thinks that every autistic person without an intellectual disability is faking it. She never actually says that, but intellectual disability repeatedly functions as her marker of diagnostic certainty, while fluent, reflective, late diagnosed people, they become the doubtful group. It's not really either or. They are different axes. Intellectual disability is not a more concentrated form of autism. You can't add a spoonful of intellectual ability to someone with intellectual disabilities and then watch their autism disappear. Language ability is also not a transparent measure of intelligence. Age of diagnosis is not an autistic trait. But before we reach Uta's 8 cultural drivers, we need to look at her strongest piece of evidence. The later diagnosed profile showed a stronger genetic correlation with ADHD, major depressive disorder, and PTSD. This suggests potential diagnostic misclassification. These lines come from a major 2025 study by Zhang and colleagues. The researchers found partly distinct developmental and polygenic profiles associated with earlier and later autism diagnosis. The later diagnosed profile had substantially stronger genetic correlations with ADHD, depression, PTSD, and several related traits. Uta's logic then is that late diagnosed autism genetically overlaps with ADHD, depression, and PTSD, therefore these people may be misclassified, therefore a different category. Problem is that Uta has not kept up to date with developments in her own field. These diagnoses can co-occur, and for most of her career, the rulebook literally forbade saying so. Under DSM-4 from 1994 to 2013, you could not diagnose ADHD alongside autism. The ADHD criteria actually contained an exclusion. It says, the symptoms do not occur exclusively during the course of a pervasive developmental disorder. Plain English, if autism was on the file, ADHD was off the table. DSM-5 removed that exclusion in 2013, several years after Uta left her post at UCL. So, of course, the older, early diagnosed cohort doesn't look like ADHD on paper, and the newer cohort does. For 20 years, clinicians were instructed to pick just one. The difference between her two groups is partly an artifact of a rule that changed. AuDHD didn't suddenly start existing in 2013, but if you're just looking at the paper, yeah, it kind of did. As for genetic correlation between conditions, it is actually the norm, not a red flag, and Uta would know this. Nearly everything correlates with nearly everything in psychiatric genetics. Overlap with ADHD is exactly what you'd expect from a real, commonly co-occurring neurodevelopmental condition. It is not evidence of a fake one. I'm going to point out something else in Uta's language. She keeps calling the late diagnosed group's difficulties mental health problems. Now, autism is a neurodevelopmental condition, not a mental health problem. And I know she doesn't explicitly say that autism is a mental illness, but every time she uses the phrase mental health problems for the late diagnosed group, she's quietly presupposing her conclusion that whatever it is that they have, it's mental health problems, it isn't autism. Uta gives us 8 cultural drivers, which she says has changed the meaning of autism. In the abstract, she goes further. She says these drivers have all led to a lowering of the diagnostic threshold. So let's take them one at a time, because this is the meat of the paper, and it's also where her argument starts to fall apart. The first driver is inclusiveness. From my own experience in the 1960s to 1970s, I can say that clinicians and researchers saw only children, not adults, and all these children belonged to a subgroup of the larger group of children with intellectual disabilities. To many of us, the diagnostic criteria seemed too narrow and unfair on marginal cases. The first push towards the widening of the category and subsequent increase in prevalence came with Lorna Wing's proposal of a spectrum. This included cases with a milder or somewhat atypical symptoms, as well as cases with vastly different intellectual abilities. Now we can ask, has the desire for inclusiveness eventually led to over-inclusion? That sounds like a reasonable question. A category can become so broad that it stops being useful, and if the criteria have expanded, we should absolutely ask whether they still identify a coherent group. But Uta's paper does something slippery here. It treats widening and over-inclusion as though they are different words for the same thing. They aren't. Widening can mean that we've started identifying people who were always autistic but were excluded by an artificially narrow model. Over-inclusion means that we're diagnosing people who are not autistic. Those possibilities can coexist, but an increase in prevalence does not tell us how much of either one is happening. That tells us something very important about the population researchers were looking at. It does not tell us that autism itself belonged exclusively to that population. If you search for autism only among children with intellectual disabilities, then your picture of autism will look like childhood plus intellectual disability. That is a sampling problem. It is not the natural boundary of where autism starts and ends. But Uta is cherry-picking dates here. From her own experience in the 1960s and 70s, so what happened between Leo Kanner's Autism Patient Zero in 1943 through to the 1990s? Was that the original widening of the spectrum before Uta even came along? Kanner's original 1943 cohort was not an ID cohort. Case 1 was Donald Triplett, who worked as a banker. He had a degree in French, he played golf, and he had a long, fulfilled life. Kanner himself wrote about islets of ability and good cognitive potential. Hans Asperger in 1944 described his own little professors, verbal and capable, in exactly the same period. What happened mid-century is that autism research, predominantly in the United States, it drifted into institutionalized populations and ID populations because, for the want of simplicity, those were the people actually in front of clinicians day by day. Uta's own sentence says exactly this. Clinicians and researchers saw only children, a subgroup of a larger group of children with intellectual disabilities. Then, Lorna Wing's Spectrum and her 1981 revival of Asperger's work didn't stretch autism into new territory, it recovered the capable presentations that were there in the 1940s and 50s and had been lost to a sampling artifact of institutionalized research in the mid-century. So when Uta says that the autism category has widened, what's actually happened is that the field stopped mistaking its own narrow sampling for autism. When the DSM-5 was being developed, the prominent criticism ran in the opposite direction. Studies of the proposed criteria warned that they were more restrictive and could exclude a substantial number of people diagnosed under DSM-4, particularly cognitively able people and those previously labelled PDD-NOS. CDC researchers also projected a lower measured prevalence when the new criteria were applied rigidly to existing records. That does not prove DSM-5 got the boundary right, or that the diagnostic practice has never loosened. it does show that the history is not a one-way ratchet towards ever broader criteria. The last major rewrite was criticised for raising the gate. If Uta wants to demonstrate over-inclusion, she needs evidence that the broader criteria are producing false positives. She would need to show how often this happens, which groups are affected, what they were mistaken for, and by what standard their autism diagnoses are wrong. She does none of that here. She doesn't even try. She observes that the diagnosed population has changed and then just pronounces, like the priesthood, if you will, over-inclusion. Citation needed, Uta. Driver number 2 is looping. How are diagnostic categories maintained when there is no objective biomarker? What autistic people write in their autobiographies or portray on social media influences what appears in textbooks and in diagnostic instruments. This creates a looping cycle, as proposed by the philosopher Ian Hacking. Ian Hacking's basic point was that classifications of people can change the people being classified. First, experts create a new category. Then lay people learn about the category and interpret themselves through it. Their behaviour, their language, and their self-understanding may change as a result. Then the experts observe those changes and adjust the category, and round it goes. That is a real and very interesting problem. Looping also applies to every other psychiatric and psychological category, including the categories Uta trusts. Experts are part of the loop. Textbooks are part of the loop. Clinics are part of the loop. Uta Frith's own research helped change what autism meant, which changed who clinicians recognised, which changed who appeared in later research. That is looping too. There's no need to point exclusively at actually autistic adults who are actually finding their voices and perhaps authoring books, talking on social media, or God forbid, have YouTube channels, and then saying that they're the ones responsible for the positive feedback loop. Uta only applies this looping concept in one direction, by the way. Autistic people writing about their lives might contaminate the category. No good could come of it, right? Social media might contaminate the category. Expert clinicians, meanwhile, appear to stand somewhere outside of culture and space and time and simply perceive autism as it really is. Uta makes that hierarchy fairly explicit. It is no longer left solely to expert clinicians to define autism. Well, no, it isn't. And given the history of autism, that is probably healthy. But every single late diagnosis that Uta doubts was made by an expert clinician. Nobody self-issues an autism diagnosis on the NHS after we're years on a waiting list. Moreover, those diagnoses are not made by one expert clinician, but taken to a multidisciplinary team before any rubber stamp touches the paper. The same profession that Uta holds up as a gold standard is the one signing off on diagnoses that she now wants to unwind. So her real complaint can't be that experts have lost control of the category. They haven't. It's that today's experts applying today's criteria keep reaching conclusions that she doesn't like. Then there is the biomarker question. Uta asks how we maintain a diagnostic category without an objective biomarker. The obvious answer is, with great difficulty. But the absence of a biomarker applies to the whole autism spectrum. There is no blood test for early diagnosed children with intellectual disabilities either. If the lack of a biomarker makes late diagnosed autism suspect, it also makes Uta's preferred cases suspect by the same logic. Psychology has spent decades dealing with this problem. A construct does not become valid only when somebody finds a molecule for it. We test whether it can be measured consistently, whether different measures converge, whether it predicts relevant outcomes, and whether it can be distinguished from neighbouring constructs. That's a process that psychologists call construct validity. I covered this in my last video on this topic, and it becomes very important when we reach masking. So yes, autism is a moving target. Our understanding has changed because autistic people, clinicians, and researchers do all affect one another. Hacking's work helps explain that process. It doesn't tell us that earlier definition was somehow pure, while everything added later is cultural contamination, simply just because it includes people Uta doesn't trust. If anything, Uta's preferred version of autism itself is the product of a particular loop. A period where researchers mostly studied children with intellectual disabilities and built theories around those children and then trained clinicians to recognise the picture those theories produced to the exclusion of everything else, including, but not limited to, The very children they studied turning 18 and suddenly not being autistic anymore. Driver 3 is social contagion. Social contagion is not faking it, rather it is a survival mechanism to align with the tribe. Nevertheless, giving a medical label to the outcome of this process risks sliding into overdiagnosis. I'm going to be really generous here, because social influence obviously exists. People do copy one another. We adopt the language of the groups we join. We notice experiences after somebody gives us a name for them. Some people exaggerate or perform aspects of an identity. Some people mirror the people around them because fitting in feels safer than standing out. None of that is particular to autism. And yes, on the internet, somewhere, there will be somebody right now pretending to have a disability for attention. Call the performative fringe disability maxing if you like. The internet contains 8 billion people and at least 9 billion bad takes. I'm prepared to concede that somebody somewhere is being a dickhead online. Fine. Disability maxing exists and it's annoying. Now, explain what any of that has to do with the 45-year-old in a clinic who's been on a waiting list for 2 years. Person A performing autistic traits online does not make person B's assessment invalid. That step needs evidence. How many people begin by seeing autism content and then later receive a diagnosis? How many of those diagnoses fail under careful reassessment? What alternative diagnosis explains their developmental history and current difficulties better? Are clinicians simply repeating a patient's TikTok vocabulary, or are they evaluating that account against diagnosis, criteria, childhood evidence, observations, and differential diagnoses? The existence of influence does not answer any of those questions. Memes spread. Language spreads. Communities develop shared ways of talking and telling stories. That tells us nothing about whether the underlying experiences are fake or invented. People also learn the language of depression, sexuality, trauma, and chronic pain from other people. Sometimes that language misleads. Sometimes it gives the first usable description of a life that somebody's been living for years. Uta partly concedes this. She writes that the surge, and I quote, cannot be mere contagion, but may also represent a long overdue realization of unmet mental health problems. Autism is not a mental health problem, but she's on the right sort of lines. Autistic people frequently have co-occurring mental health problems. A person can be autistic and anxious, or autistic and depressed. They can be autistic and traumatized. They can, not autistic and female, and we'll get to that later. Sarcasm. That's a line too far. But, modern diagnostic practice does allow conditions to coexist now. And for a long time, the rules and habits of diagnosis encouraged clinicians to choose just one explanation. Autism could be missed because anxiety was more visible, or AuDHD could be missed because autism was already on the file, or vice versa. Intellectual disability could overshadow everything else, and often does. The fact that a person has another condition does not automatically make their autism a misclassification. And if Uta thinks that the late diagnosed population contains several different groups, yeah, sure, I agree. Some will be autistic, some will have another condition, some will have both, or more than one, or more than two, right? Some may be wrongly diagnosed. That is what assessment with an experienced clinician supported by a multidisciplinary team with experience in working with adults is for. Her editorial keeps taking the possibility of error and writing as though it establishes the direction of the error. It doesn't. Social contagion might contribute to some false positives. I suspect that it does. It might also help previously missed autistic people recognize a pattern and ask for an assessment. Without data comparing those possibilities, contagion is a story about a rise. It's not an explanation of it. I really hope that's clear. Let me know in the comments below if that was just a load of waffle. I think it was clear. It was clear to me. Let me know if it's clear to you too. Driver 4 is lived experience. While lived experience is incredibly valuable for understanding a patient's perspective, an uncritical reliance on subjective experiences for the purpose of diagnosis can be treacherous. It may fuel diagnostic inflation by pathologizing normal human variations. There's a fair point buried in that sentence. Self-report is imperfect. People misunderstand themselves. Memory can be reconstructive. We absorb explanations from the culture around us. A competent assessment should not accept every interpretation uncritically. But diagnosis of an internal experience cannot happen without subjective evidence. Anxiety, sensory overwhelm, confusion, the effort required to navigate a conversation, the reasons that somebody might avoid eye contact in the West. An observer can see behaviour, but they cannot directly see what produces it. That is why self-report is evidence. It is not the only evidence, and it's not sacred, but it is evidence. Uta later writes, intellectually impaired and non-verbal individuals are necessarily left out of these subjective narratives. That sentence fuses several things. Speaking is not thinking. Some minimally speaking and non-speaking autistic people communicate in depth through typing and AAC devices. They're only necessarily left out if spoken language is treated as the only form of testimony that counts. I'll say it again in case Uta is listening. Speaking is not thinking. Intellectual disability is another axis again. In the CDC's 2022 surveillance data, roughly 4 in 10 autistic 8-year-olds with cognitive information available had a co-occurring intellectual disability. The majority did not. There's only one American child surveillance system. It's not a universal law, but it illustrates my point. Autism and intellectual disability overlap without being interchangeable. Non-speaking, intellectually disabled, and autistic are not 3 names for the same group of people, and they never have been. Language, cognition, and autistic features need to be assessed separately, and they are assessed separately. Uta does know this. And if subjective narratives currently exclude people with the highest communication needs, the answer is to widen the forms of communication that we accept, not treat subjective evidence as suspect. If you'll excuse the pun, in other words, why can't an expert clinician allow a patient to use AAC devices in a clinic to communicate? Uta's standard also changes depending on whose subjectivity is involved. A few paragraphs earlier, she writes, in the past, my colleagues and I felt confident that we could recognise autism at first impression in a thin slice judgment. So, the autistic person's account may be treacherous, but the expert's first opinion apparently carries authority. A thin slice judgment is still subjective after all. It is the observer reporting what another person feels like to them after a brief exposure. Expertise might improve that judgment, but confidence is not validation. Sasson and colleagues showed us in 2017 that non-autistic people form rapid and often negative impressions of autistic people from a very brief social piece of information. It's not a study of diagnosis, but it's about something more basic. Snap judgments measure the observer as well as the person being observed. Look, I feel like a great many autistic people out there are very aware of the feelings of being on the receiving end of somebody's rapid, thin-sliced judgment. It is most definitely a thing. A clinician may notice something real in seconds. A clinician might also notice a stereotype. They might misread anxiety. They might miss somebody who has rehearsed the interaction or confuse fluent speech with the absence of a disability. The answer is combine evidence. Developmental history, observation, structured instruments where useful, all of the various, assessment frameworks. The frog book, collateral information wherever it exists, functional impact and serious consideration of alternative explanations, OCD rituals versus autistic ones, for example. And that's exactly what happens in autism assessments. Uta is right that ordinary human variation can be pathologized. Autistic traits are continuously distributed. Autism traits are continuously distributed. Across the whole population. All humans have some level of autistic traits. Many non-autistic people prefer routine, dislike eye contact in the West, become absorbed in their interests or find socializing exhausting. Diagnosis requires a pattern, developmental onset, and clinically significant impairment, disability. A relatable trait on its own is not autism. Uta knows all of this. Then Uta writes that questions are rarely asked about whether people have the metacognitive ability to reflect accurately on their own behaviour. Are they self-aware, in other words? Rarely asked. How does she know? By who? In what assessments? How often? Compared with what? There's no citation. Citation needed, Uta. Because the paper asks us to distrust the self-knowledge of an entire population on the basis of an unsupported claim about what clinicians supposedly failed to ask. All of this without actually asking any clinician. And the irony is so big it could swallow an elderly researcher in just one bite. Uta's recollection that she and her colleagues could recognise autism at first impression is accepted as meaningful evidence. The late diagnosed autistic's recollection of a lifetime spent struggling is treated as potentially treacherous. Neither should be treated uncritically, but neither should be dismissed automatically out of hand. Both are claims that can be checked against other evidence. Which brings us to the point where lived experience becomes, in Uta's telling, a search for identity. Frith says, self-diagnosis has become incredibly common. We can assume that only individuals with sufficient cognitive and metacognitive abilities are likely to ponder their place in society in this way. Hence, the focus shifts away from the most impaired individuals. Firstly, how common is incredibly common? Citation needed, Uta. More importantly, self-identification and clinical diagnosis are being collapsed into one thing. I prefer the term self-identification for the moment. Somebody first recognises themselves in autistic people's experiences. They see similarities, they read, they listen, they try an explanation on for size. That person may be right. They may also be wrong. They may later seek an assessment from an expert clinician who is supposed to examine the evidence rather than rubber stamp a TikTok quiz. As if anyone is doing that. Recognising yourself in a description is not the same as issuing yourself a medical diagnosis, and it is certainly not proof that the clinician who later diagnoses you has been socially infected somehow. Someone who, say, just calls themselves autistic, right, without a formal medical diagnosis, isn't appearing in the data, and therefore isn't part of this incredibly common statistic that Uta alludes to but never provides. They're still invisible as far as the system goes. Then the intellectual disability lens returns. Uta reasons that a person needs enough cognitive and metacognitive ability to search for an identity, which means that the people telling these stories are not the most impaired. Their visibility then shifts attention away from the people that she regards as the centre of autism. Attention, from whom and about what, it's not a fixed size pie. Autistic adults talking about their lives does not remove an iota of support from autistic people with intellectual disabilities. The shortage of support is a policy and a resource problem. Silencing one group does not create services or abundance for another. And being unable to produce a polished first-person narrative does not mean that somebody lacks a rich internal life. Speech is not a transparent measure of intelligence. Neither is the ability to write an autobiography. Non-speaking autistic people who type independently have written about their lives in depth, and they don't exist anywhere in Uta's paradox of autism. Some autistic people need lifelong care. Some cannot reliably communicate their experience in words. Some can write books if supported to do so. Books like this one, written by non-speaking autistic people. Uta then writes, "These dangers of self-diagnosis have been comprehensively discussed in a previous editorial in this journal." That previous editorial that she mentions is David and Deeley's 2024 paper, Dangers of Self-Diagnosis in Neuropsychiatry. I read it. It is wild. Amongst other things, it suggests that a born this way explanation can help people avoid culpability and seek dispensation. In other words, the starting suspicion is that you want a diagnosis to escape responsibility or to gain a social benefit. Of course, a diagnosis can be misused. People can use any explanation as an excuse for anything. But a diagnosis can also help somebody take responsibility more effectively. If I know why a particular environment overwhelms me, I can plan for it. If I know why communication keeps going wrong, I can work on it. Explanation does not automatically remove agency. The paper also claims that self-diagnosis of schizophrenia does not seem to be an option, and that the neurodiversity movement does not include people with such conditions. As far as I can tell, this is far too neat a claim. Neurodiversity is not some club. Does anyone have a neurodiversity club membership card? What are the terms of reference of the group? It's not an organisation or a club with a definitive membership list. Some versions focus narrowly on autism and ADHD. Other versions of neurodiversity explicitly include psychiatric conditions, psychosis, and other perspectives. You can criticise any of those positions, but you cannot make the entire neurodiversity movement disappear by defining it around examples that just so happen to be most convenient to your argument. You can't make shit up, other words. The paper should be filed away in the dictionary as a de facto example of a straw man fallacy. This is the source Uta uses to establish the dangers of self-diagnosis. An editorial points to another editorial for comprehensive support. It's just editorials all the way down. And nothing else. I should say, nothing else. This is Uta's gold standard evidence piece number 1. and only one. And once again, the concern circles back to the same group. People without intellectual disabilities can describe themselves from communities and seek diagnoses. Their ability to speak is then used as evidence that diagnostic focus has drifted away from people that Uta considers to be properly autistic. Which brings me to the chief complaint. Driver 6. Girls. Is the surge of females in late diagnosed cases simply a catch-up phenomenon? If so, we should begin to see many more early diagnosed cases of girls, but this has not happened. This deserves a proper answer. If the current rise is entirely a catch-up effect, then better recognition should eventually increase the number of girls identified in childhood. That is a reasonable prediction. If diagnostic practice improves and the childhood ratio never changes, the catch-up explanation needs work. But continued failure to recognise girls early does not prove that they become autistic later on. It may mean that we are continuing to miss them. And the pattern Uta cites, roughly 3 boys for every 1 girl before age 15, moving towards 1-to-1 after 15, is also compatible with delayed recognition. The ratio changes at the exact point the supposedly missed group begins receiving diagnoses. That does not prove the catch-up account either. The same numbers could be produced by several mechanisms. We'd need longitudinal data, diagnostic histories, and careful comparison of early and late diagnosed groups to separate them. Uta instead reaches for an alternative explanation. Perhaps many of these women belong to another diagnostic category, or even to a category that's not yet been named. Then it gets wild. It's kind of funny, really. Gina Rippon, Lost Girls of Autism, disproved. You know why? We get temporal grandin. This ignores the case of temporal grandin, a long-haired prototype of autism. No, it doesn't. Sorry, the existence of one highly visible autistic woman does not show that girls and women were recognised accurately at population level. What do you mean, Gina? Girls weren't overlooked. Look, there's one. There's one over there. Catch her now. Get her. Get the nets. Temporal grandin is an N of 1. A famous counterexample can disprove the absolute claim. You can't say now that no woman has ever been diagnosed with autism. Like, you can't say that because temporal grandin. You can't. But you can't then tell us how many other women were misdiagnosed, or never assessed. I mean, if somebody were to point to another autistic woman who isn't temporal grandin, I think at this point Uta Frith's brain would explode. A 100% increase in girl autism, this is outrageous, she'd say, being shown n equals 2 at that point. I made this exact point after Uta's last interview. Now, the same move is in a peer-reviewed editorial, and it still does not work. There's another problem. Many late-diagnosed women already have other labels: anxiety, depression, eating disorders, personality disorders, ADHD, trauma-related diagnoses. Uta treats these alternatives as reasons to doubt autism, as though any co-occurring condition is a better explanation. You cannot decide which story is true purely from the age at which somebody finally received their autism diagnosis, especially as access to autism assessments has never been equitable. I put the costs of mine on a credit card. Uta considers the possibility of a missed female presentation, cites work discussing it, and then prefers a completely different, unnamed category. She offers no method for deciding who belongs in it, only that they don't belong in her vision of autism. And again, look at the group under suspicion. People diagnosed later, disproportionately women, generally able to describe their own experiences and less likely to have an intellectual disability. The ID lens is still there, it just has some sort of like gender cataract over it. The main explanation offered for why these girls and women might have been missed is in her driver number 7. Driver 7 is masking. This is her load-bearing argument. I often wonder if the concept of masking is what opened the floodgates. If masking can be used to explain the total absence of symptoms, then in theory this could lower the diagnostic threshold to 0. That would be a serious problem. If somebody can show that no autistic traits, report no developmental history consistent with autism, and experience no relevant impairment, then they are masking cannot be used as magic words to make all contrary evidence disappear. But that is not what masking means in either the diagnostic criteria or the research literature. And Uta should know this. Does Uta remember this or not? I wonder if Uta's memory is failing a little bit. The criteria still requires autistic features. They must have been present from the early developmental period, even if they only became obvious when social demands exceeded the person's capacity or were hidden by learned strategies later in life. That's the definition from the DSM-5. Masking can obscure evidence and make an assessment more difficult. It can't conjure a developmental history out of nowhere. In my last video, I said that Uta's objection sounded like a falsifiability argument. If every apparent absence can be explained away as masking, then there's no possible evidence against the diagnosis. Her conclusion doesn't follow. A construct can be abused without the construct itself being meaningless. The solution is to define it, measure it, see what it predicts. You can test it, which Uta must know researchers have done. Why does this feel like I'm arguing with an anti-vaxxer or a flat earther at this point? Camouflaging is the umbrella term most used in the literature. In the CAT-Q, one of the dominant measures, it is divided into compensation, masking, and assimilation. Compensation means developing strategies to navigate difficulties, perhaps learning social scripts or consciously calculating social rules. Masking means hiding or suppressing behaviours that might be read as autistic. Assimilation is the effort to blend in or to fit in with social situations. These three overlap, but they are not one mysterious claim based entirely on somebody saying that they feel tired. Uta actually distinguishes compensation from masking and then treats masking as though the subjective cost is almost the whole thing. That makes the idea easier to dismiss, but it doesn't represent how the broader literature operationalizes it. And then she asks, how does this kind of camouflaging differ from the adaptation and impression management that everyone practices in their social interactions? Quick answer, it's intensity, duration, and cost. Everybody manages the impression that they make. Everybody changes their behaviour across contexts. Everyone adjusts at a job interview. Not everybody has to also suppress stimming, forcing eye contact through discomfort, maybe, if that's your thing, running a manual social prediction engine and then burning out and collapsing as a result. The proposed difference is not that autistic people possess a unique human ability to act differently at work, it's the intensity of it. Researchers look at the extent and the frequency and the motivation, the reasons, right? And then the cost of that effort, and all of these things can be measured. Are you occasionally being polite to your manager, or are you manually calculating an interaction that other people navigate automatically? Are you choosing professional manners, or are you suppressing movement, rehearsing facial expressions, doing the face dance, as Pio Novelli says, forcing eye contact, and monitoring every sentence because the experience has taught you that your natural behaviours would be punished socially? It's not an exact silver bullet. There is a bit of a fuzzy boundary here, but it's not the same as saying no measurable difference. And there's plenty of data. In April 2026, before this editorial was submitted, Grieg, Konduris, and Henry published a meta-analysis in the journal Autism. It combined 50 studies and 16,895 people. I wish they'd found like 105 more to get the round 17,000, but I digress. Across that evidence, autistic traits and camouflaging showed a correlation of 0.34. A correlation of 0 would mean no relationship. 1 would mean perfect lockstep. Now, in psychology, the old textbook convention says that a correlation of 0.1 is small, 0.3 is medium, 0.5 is large, it's massive. Like, the newer empirically based benchmarks go a bit further and class 0.3 as a large effect for this kind of research. Either way, their findings were a correlation of 0.34. That's not nothing, okay? The more autistic traits somebody had, the more they tended to camouflage, and that's a pattern that held across nearly 17,000 people. The relationship was not perfect. Nobody claims that it is. Some people with fewer measured autistic traits camouflage heavily. Some autistic people camouflage very little, if at all. But this is measurable, it's a testable association. It's like saying that taller people tend to weigh more than shorter people. Sure, you can point at a few outliers, but you can make a moderate to large correlation of about the same confidence between height and weight, just like autistic traits and camouflaging. The meta-analysis also found relationships between camouflaging and poorer mental health outcomes. Again, this does not prove that camouflaging causes every case of anxiety, depression, or distress. It tells us the subjective reports are not floating free of measurable patterns. It's not made up. Uta cites Livingston, Shah, and Happy's work to distinguish compensation from masking. Now, Francesca Happe is one of Uta's long-standing collaborators, and this year, Happe's own group, in a study with Ali and Mandy, also reported a shared core experience of autistic burnout across early and late diagnosed autistic adults. The late diagnosed group described additional costs associated with spending years without an explanation. That does not prove every late diagnosis is correct. It is evidence of continuity, where Uta's argument expects a completely different category, or like masking is magic, therefore. You know? Then Uta writes, but exhaustion, fatigue, meltdown or burnout are prevalent in other mental health conditions and can have many different causes. True. So are sleep problems. So is anxiety. So is difficulty concentrating. Symptoms and consequences can occur in more than one condition. Nobody diagnoses autism because a person is tired. Exhaustion is proposed as one possible cost of sustained camouflaging. It is not the diagnostic criterion, and it does not need to be exclusive to autism to be real. Roisenberg and colleagues found that camouflaging added very little predictive power for some outcomes once social anxiety was taken into account. Current questionnaires, like the CAT-Q, may capture a broader kind of social self-monitoring, as well as something autism-specific. They may not yet separate masking from anxiety, trauma, or minority stress as cleanly as researchers would like. But after all of this fairly long-winded explanation, saying simply masking has no scientific basis does not describe accurately the state of the field. You could say something like, masking is real but imperfectly measured and its specificity remains contested. That would be defensible. And at this point it feels like I'm arguing with a flat earther, because an accurate statement doesn't help if your actual goal, hot take here, was to dismiss late diagnosed autistic people. It feels political. There's a large swathe of rhetoric here. I'm getting more rhetoric than science here. We cannot spend years rewarding autistic people for hiding autistic behaviour and then act baffled when some become difficult to recognise. Compensation and masking can complicate diagnosis. They can be over-invoked. They are not a licence to lower the threshold to 0. They are observable and measurable attempts to survive environments that often punish autistic behaviour. And if Uta wants to challenge the quality of that measurement, brilliant. I mean, that is a scientific argument worth having. Pretending the evidence is absent is not. The 8th and final driver is harm avoidance. Uta draws on Nick Haslam's idea of concept creep, the tendency for terms associated with harm to expand over time, covering milder experiences and broader categories of people. Again, this is a real debate. If every unpleasant experience becomes trauma, and every awkward interaction becomes abuse, and every personality difference becomes a disorder, then language can lose precision. Broadening a concept can increase compassion, but it can also medicalise ordinary life. And I don't think that's controversial. Then Uta applies that concern to autism. Diagnosis of ASD that is a false positive can easily become a self-fulfilling prophecy and is hard to undo. Yes, a false diagnosis can cause harm. A person may reinterpret every difficulty through the wrong framework. Clinicians may overlook the condition that they actually have. Expectations may shrink. Family members, schools or employers may treat the label as some sort of manifest destiny. Labels do shape people. I made a video about this a long time ago on the channel. So do the labels: lazy, difficult, dramatic, gifted, attention-seeking, not trying hard enough, whatever. The possibility of a self-fulfilling prophecy is not unique to autism. It is an argument for careful diagnosis and periodic reconsideration. But Uta only counts one side of the error coin. A false positive has a cost, but so does a false negative. The missed autistic person may spend decades believing that they're defective, selfish, or uniquely incapable of managing ordinary life. They may receive treatments aimed at the wrong problem. There is a recognised pattern of misdiagnosis of BPD in autistic women, for instance. They may repeatedly enter environments that overwhelm them because nobody recognises the pattern. They may lose access to adjustments, community, and an explanation that helps them make better decisions. A responsible system should minimise both errors. Uta's editorial repeatedly foregrounds the harm of diagnosing somebody who's not autistic and barely considers the harm of refusing to diagnose somebody who is. That asymmetry matters because it predetermines which direction appears safe. If only false positives count as harm, tightening the gate will always look responsible. It's political rhetoric, very thinly veiled as science. Then we reach culture. Uta discusses 37 films featuring autism and asks why autism has become such a popular cultural meme. I make autism videos. You're watching one. Clearly the subject exists in culture. There is an answer to a question though. Online, autism has become shorthand for a very loose bundle of behaviours and stereotypes. At its ugliest, the word is used as a euphemism where the R slur used to sit. That itself is a cultural confusion of autism with intellectual disability. At the other extreme sits the Hollywood savant shelf. Rain Man, Sheldon Cooper, and the socially baffled genius who can perform a miracle with numbers before the third act. So popular culture keeps bouncing between two caricatures. Autism means intellectual disability when someone wants an insult, and superhuman intelligence when a writer wants an eccentric genius. Actual autistic people disappear into the gap between them. Some representations are dreadful, some online claims are nonsense, some autism memes describe broad human experiences and then present them as diagnostic revelation. I've made entire videos laughing with and dissecting autism memes. I even have a playlist for some light-hearted entertainment if you want that. You might want that now after this long video, linked below. But visibility is not evidence that a diagnosis has lost its meaning. Concepts can become culturally popular because it is fashionable. It can also become visible because people who are isolated have become less isolated. Creators have discovered an audience and public has finally learned enough to recognise lives that it previously ignored. The existence of 37 films does not tell us which explanation is correct. Box office receipts are not some sort of prevalence data. Now, according to IMDb, there are about 180 to 200 shark movies, and I think the vast majority of them portray sharks incorrectly. Hollywood often takes artistic license for entertainment. There are probably 1,000 movies in which guns never run out of ammunition and silencers make them silent. You know what I mean? And some movies have literal superheroes in them. I mean, that's not real, so what? What does it prove exactly? After the 8 drivers, Uta turns to what she calls the tension between the medical and social models of autism. One cannot logically argue that autism is not a disorder while using a disorder-based diagnosis to claim rights and accommodations. This dilemma suggests that the movement functions more as a political and moral identity rather than a scientifically useful classification. I don't think there's a dilemma. Autism can be both a human difference and a disability. Clinically, the diagnosis requires significant impairment. The social model does not claim that nothing is difficult or that impairments vanish if everyone becomes nicer. It argues that a disability is partly produced at the point where a person meets an environment built without them in mind. A wheelchair user can have a real physical disability, demand legal accommodations and point out that a flight of stairs creates disability which a ramp can remove. Nobody calls that a logical contradiction. The same principle applies here. An autistic person can have intrinsic sensory, communication and cognitive difficulties while also being more disabled by fluorescent lighting, ambiguous expectations, inaccessible communication and people who punish harmless autistic behaviour. Eye contact is another useful example here. Western clinical practice spent decades treating atypical eye contact as a particularly revealing sign, but eye gaze norms vary across cultures. Cross-clinical research finds meaningful differences in how much eye contact people make and how direct gaze is interpreted, particularly around elders and authority. My father is English and my mother's Malaysian. Eye contact norms are essentially opposite in each culture. Is one culture's eye contact broken? Obviously not. That does not make autistic differences imaginary. It just shows that the social meaning and functional cost of an observable behaviour depend partly on context. That is the social model's point. Then Uta writes, "It's only a small step from here to claiming a superpower." I will grant her part of this. The superpower rhetoric annoys plenty of autistic adults too. Autism does not give everybody flawless memory, mathematical genius, or the ability to debug the matrix. Some neurodiversity advocates do use the word. Much of the loudest superpower material, though, also comes from corporate inspiration campaigns and the autism parent corner, where most people understandably trying to cast a positive light over their disabled child's future. Pause the video and go Google autism as a superpower and see what the image search gives you. Who's making that stuff? It's not the late diagnosed group, I can tell you that much. Uta continues. Parents and carers of profoundly autistic individuals feel upset and bewildered. Some undoubtedly do. How many? In response to what? Compared with whom? And who makes the autism is my superpower claims? Citation needed, Uta. And then she writes, people who receive an ASD diagnosis as adolescents or adults often report overwhelmingly positive effects. Again, how often? And according to which evidence? She makes it sound like an autism diagnosis is a margarita. Citation needed again, Uta. The honest picture is more complicated than overwhelmingly positive. Diagnosis can bring relief and grief at the same time. Relief because a lifetime finally makes sense, and grief for the years spent without an explanation and without support that might have changed things in your past. A diagnosis can also provide access to adjustments and services, a framework for understanding your history, and a route into a community. Reducing all of that to the therapeutic power of receiving a label misses what the label actually does. Uta then discusses the psychological essentialism, the tendency to treat a medical label as revealing a deep inner truth. That is plausible. Formal medical labels carry more perceived weight than informal identities, which may be exactly why people seek professional confirmation in the first place. But follow that logic to the end. If a self-applied label already delivered everything people wanted, why then would they queue for years, spend money, and submit to assessment by the expert clinicians that Uta trusts? Her essentialism argument helps explain the demand for formal diagnosis. It does not show that those diagnoses are wrong. If anything, it undercuts the panic that everyone's satisfied by self-diagnosing from a TikTok. Neurodiversity is political and moral. So is every argument about who receives a diagnosis and accommodation or public support. That does not prevent its empirical claims from being tested, and it does not turn the medical model into a politically neutral view from nowhere. Autism can be a difference, a disability and a diagnosis at the same time. Support should follow the person's actual needs, not a philosophical loyalty test. Which brings us back through all 8 drivers. Uta cites inclusiveness as over-inclusion without a measured false positive rate. Looping is applied only to autistic people, but not to the experts. Social influence becomes diagnostic contagion without evidence connecting the two. Lived experience is treated as less trustworthy than clinical first impressions. Self-identification becomes a suspicious search for exemption. Late diagnosed women are assigned to a category that has not been defined. Masking is reduced to an untestable excuse despite substantial empirical literature, and the harm of false diagnosis is counted while the harm of misdiagnosis is largely ignored. Across every section, the same group of autistic people remain under suspicion. Late diagnosed autistic people, people who can describe their experience, people without intellectual disabilities, and disproportionately, adult women. Uta presents 8 different cultural explanations, and they keep coming back to one dividing line. And then I found something she said 4 months before this paper was published, which makes the whole argument look rather different. And then I found this. On the 1st of April 2026, the Science Media Centre published expert reactions to the government's interim review of the rise in autism and ADHD diagnoses. Uta said, "The underlying prevalence of ADHD and autism seems to be relatively stable." In that response, she described the growth in recorded diagnoses as largely administrative and driven by social factors. 4 months later, this editorial opens by saying that autism prevalence has increased massively. If the underlying prevalence is relatively stable, then the additional autistic people appearing in the statistics did not suddenly materialise because social media made autism fashionable, because they were already in the population. But if Uta wants the rise to support misdiagnosis, then she has to tell us how much of it comes from false positives rather than improved recognition. Uta's proposed solution is to split the spectrum. Splitting up the spectrum would ultimately prevent misdiagnosis. How? Before rebuilding separate categories, it's worth remembering why Asperger's disorder, autistic disorder, and PDD-NOS were merged into one autism spectrum in DSM-5. The old labels were not reliably separating people. In a major multi-site study led by Catherine Lord, the specific diagnoses a child received varied markedly between clinics. Clinical characteristics mattered, but so did the habits of the site doing the assessment. Which door you walked through helped determine whether you left with a diagnosis of autistic disorder, Asperger's, or PDD-NOS. The categories were merged because the boundaries were not working reliably in the real world. Recreating separate bins does not prevent misdiagnosis unless the new boundary can be applied consistently and shown to improve prediction or care. Now, run the tape back through Uta's paper. Her certainty repeatedly clusters around early diagnosis, language disability, intellectual disability, and high support needs. Her doubt repeatedly clusters around later diagnosis, fluent self-report, women and people without intellectual disability. That pattern is not absolute. Plenty of early diagnosed autistic people do not have an intellectual disability, and some people with intellectual disabilities are diagnosed late. But the practical dividing line running through her argument looks much more like autism with and without intellectual disability than any two different conditions established by actual evidence. And the bombshell to this very long-running video is that the current diagnostic practice can already record that distinction. The DSM does not create multiple separate autism diagnoses. It uses specifiers: autism with or without accompanying intellectual impairment, with or without accompanying language impairment, alongside support needs and co-occurring conditions. The clinically important difference Uta keeps reaching for is already representable without removing anybody from autism. Uta knows the group of early diagnosed children with co-occurring intellectual disability. That's her thing. There are already qualifiers that work to label this group. Then Uta ends with her constructive proposal. We need a fresh attempt to define the specific causes of the distress and disability experienced by many of the late diagnosed cases so we can custom make the support they need. That is true for an autistic child diagnosed at 3 with an intellectual disability. It is also true for an autistic adult diagnosed at 53 without one. Diagnosis alone never tells you what support somebody needs. When her final sentence works equally well for both proposed groups, it does not support splitting them. It just supports evidence needs care. So here's where I've got to. Uta has looked at a messy, overstretched system and decided the label needs to be divided further than it already is. I think the more urgent problem is the gate that we have built in front of any support. Before moving people out of autism, she needs to show that the new border can be drawn reliably, that it predicts something useful, and that the move would improve care. This editorial does absolutely none of those things. It doesn't even try. The existing diagnosis already distinguishes intellectual ability, language ability, and support needs. Research can continue looking for meaningful subtypes within it if it wants to. None of that requires pretending autistic people without intellectual disabilities somehow arrived recently or belong in some unnamed category. Why do I care? Well, because if you reclassify people out of autism, you also reclassify them out of understanding, third sector support, and potentially out of community. I'm one of those who have papers written about, diagnosed as an adult and without a learning disability, and I'm verbal, I'm capable, and I'm autistic. I never set out to obtain some sort of social benefit, by the way, and if anyone can tell me what this mysterious social benefit is and where I can find it, please do let me know. If you'd like to see my annotated version of Uta's article, it's available in full on my Patreon as a behind-the-scenes post, as well as plenty of member-only videos and access to the Scratching Post Discord community, which is now home to over 400 lovely Autistic app members. Congratulations also to the 2 winners of Stuck on Hard Mode. Your books will be posted out next week. If there's a book you think would be good to add to the Tea and Tales Book Club list, let me know in the comments below. And the Debunking Bad Science playlist is available on screen now if you would like more evidence-based rebuttals. And in the meantime, I'm going to go and get a fresh cup of tea and go back to the video that I was actually working on before Uta's article dropped. Bye for now.